In a world where fear often silenced justice, one man refused to bow his head. His name was Robert F. Williams, and his story begins in the small town of Monroe, North Carolina, a place divided by color, power, and violence. Born in 1925, in the heart of the Jim Crow South, Robert's earliest memories were not of laughter or childhood dreams, but of the sharp crack of injustice. He saw his people humiliated, beaten, and denied their most basic human rights. Yet even as a boy, something in him burned brighter than fear, a defiance inherited from generations who had refused to break. Robert's grandfather, a former slave, used to say, "You can beg a man to respect you, you have to stand so tall he can't ignore you." Those words stayed with him. His family did not preach violence. They preached dignity. But when the world around you is built to crush your spirit, sometimes dignity demands courage, even the kind that carries a rifle. As Robert grew, the America around him was changing, but not fast enough. Black veterans returned from World War I with medals on their chests, only to be treated as less than human at home. Lynching still haunted the South. Police turned a blind eye. The Klan still marched, their torches lighting up the night sky like a mockery of freedom. Robert knew one truth, that silence would never save them. This is not just the story of one man. It is the story of how a single spark of resistance lit a fire that would shake the foundations of white supremacy. A man who dared to defend his people when the system refused to. A man who refused to let his community be hunted anymore. And a man who would one day strike fear into the very organization that thrived on terror, the Ku Klux Klan. Before we dive deeper into his incredible journey, how he built the first armed black defense group in the South, how he defied both the Klan and the government, and how his philosophy inspired movements for generations, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell. Every story like this deserves to be heard, because history is not just about those who ruled, but about those who refused to kneel. Stay with us as we uncover the life of Robert F. Williams, the man who dared to fight back. When the war came, Robert F. Williams saw an opportunity not just to serve his country, but to prove something deeper, that loyalty and courage had no color. He joined the U.S. Marine Corps, a branch known for its discipline and pride, but also one that was, at the time, divided by an invisible yet powerful wall. The military, like the nation itself, was split by segregation. Black soldiers trained, ate, and slept apart from their white counterparts, often assigned the dirtiest work and denied the respect they deserved. But Robert did not let that break him. Every insult, every slight, every moment of being told he was less, he stored them, not as bitterness, but as lessons about the world he would one day confront. The Marines taught him precision, structure, and courage under pressure. They taught him how to handle a weapon, how to move with purpose, and how to protect those beside him. Yet what they could not teach was equality. That he learned by seeing the contradictions all around him. Men expected to die for a country that refused to see them as human. When Robert stood in uniform, saluting a flag that did not yet salute him back, something inside him shifted. He began to understand that freedom, real freedom, was never given. It was something taken, guarded, and defended by those who refused to surrender their humanity. After the war, he moved north to Detroit, joining the massive migration of Black Americans who sought better lives away from the South's racial terror. The city was alive with industry, the steady rhythm of machines, the hum of assembly lines, the pulse of a new kind of America built by hands like his. But Detroit was not free of injustice either. In the factories, black workers were paid less, promoted slower, and assigned to the hardest, dirtiest jobs. Yet here, Williams witnessed something different: power in numbers, power in unity. He saw white and black laborers stand shoulder to shoulder on the picket lines, demanding fair wages and safer conditions. The unions, for all their flaws, showed him what organized strength could do. When people spoke together, when they refused to be divided by race or fear, the mighty factories had no choice but to listen. For the first time, he saw what collective resistance could achieve. It was not about hate. It was not about revenge. It was about standing tall, the same lesson his grandfather had tried to teach him, now transformed into something larger. But Detroit also reminded him of something darker, that escape was never complete. The North had no lynching trees, but it had its own walls. Housing discrimination, police harassment, and unspoken barriers followed black families wherever they went. Even as he built a life for himself, Williams carried with him the memories of Monroe, the faces of those who could not leave, who still lived under the constant shadow of the Klan. Each paycheck, each breath of free air in the industrial city, reminded him that freedom meant little if it belonged only to some. He began to think more deeply about what justice required. Could peaceful appeals truly move the hearts of men who refused to see? Could patience and prayer stand against men who carried guns and burned crosses? He respected those who marched, who sang, who knelt, but he could not forget the sound of fear that haunted his childhood. The helplessness of watching friends and neighbors beaten for nothing more than wanting dignity. Somewhere in his mind, a new kind of courage was forming, one that did not depend on the permission of oppressors. Williams read widely during these years. He studied the writings of black intellectuals, anti-colonial leaders, and labor organizers. The words of people like E.B. Du Bois, Paul Robeson, and Marcus Garvey echoed in his mind, each calling for pride, self-reliance, and resistance. The struggles of African nations for independence resonated deeply with him. If entire peoples could rise against empires, why could not the black citizens of America stand up for their right to exist without fear? He began to see how the pieces connected: the Marine training that taught him discipline and self-control, the Detroit unions that revealed the power of unity, and the bitter memories of Monroe that showed the cost of silence. All of it was shaping him, hardening him, preparing him for something greater than he yet realized. His experiences were not separate chapters, but one continuous education in the meaning of freedom. By the late 1940s, the country was changing. Soldiers were coming home. New voices were rising, demanding that America live up to its own promises. Yet in Monroe, the old hatred remained untouched. Smoldering beneath the surface, Williams knew that one day he would have to return, not just to visit, but to fight. He could no longer be content with distance. The people he loved were still trapped in a system that saw them as targets. He could not look away and call himself free. With his wife Mabel by his side, he made the decision to go back, to take everything he had learned: discipline, solidarity, courage, and bring it home. The man who had once left Monroe as a young Marine returned as something else entirely, a man with a mission. He was not looking for war. He was looking for dignity. But in the Jim Crow South, those two things were often the same. The journey from the barracks to the factory floor had taught him that real change required more than words. It required readiness. It required self-respect backed by action. And as he stepped off the train, breathing in the hot Carolina air, Robert F. Williams knew that he was no longer the boy who had watched injustice in silence. He was the man who would make sure it was never met with silence again. When Robert and his wife Mabel returned to Monroe, North Carolina, they found a town still trapped in time. The red clay roads and worn wooden porches looked the same as when he had left, but beneath that quiet surface, the same old poison lingered. Jim Crow was not just a set of laws, it was a way of life. A system designed to remind every black man and woman that they had a place, And that place was beneath someone else's boot. The war had ended, but the battle for dignity had not. Williams came home not as a soldier, but as a man who understood discipline, strategy, and courage. He saw his community living under the same fear that had haunted his childhood, a fear that no one should have to accept. The Ku Klux Klan still rode through the night, their hoods glowing ghostly white under the moon, their laughter echoing after each raid. The police did not stop them. In fact, sometimes they rode with them. The courthouse still turned away black citizens who dared to ask for fairness. And children still drank from separate fountains as though their innocence carried a stain. Robert could have chosen comfort, could have kept his head down and lived quietly. But that was never his nature. He joined the local chapter of the naacp. And soon, his leadership and determination transformed it from a small, fearful group into one of the most active chapters in the South. He refused to let the organization be just another polite committee of letters and speeches. To him, the naacp was not about asking, it was about insisting. One of his first campaigns targeted Monroe's public library. Black children were forbidden from entering the building. They could only request books through a back door. Robert led a group of parents and students to the front steps, demanding equal access. The white librarian, pale and trembling, locked the doors. The local paper called it a disturbance. But the children had seen something that day, that rules could be challenged, that silence could be broken. That was what mattered to Robert most. Then came the fight for the town's swimming pool. It was the heart of Monroe's summer life, a sparkling blue oasis surrounded by a tall fence that might as well have been a wall between worlds. The town's black children played in muddy creeks while white children splashed in clean, cool water. When Williams and the naacp filed a petition to desegregate the pool, the town responded not with words, but with rage. Flyers appeared overnight warning black families to know their place. Anonymous calls threatened violence. One morning, the pool was drained and closed for maintenance, a hollow gesture to avoid integration. The message was clear. They would rather destroy what they owned than share it. Robert's presence in Monroe began to change the air. He spoke with a calm, steady confidence that unnerved both white officials and cautious black elders. He told the young men of the community that they had a right, not a wish, but a right to walk with dignity. He reminded them that citizenship was not a favor, and that the Constitution was written for them too. But such talk was dangerous in Monroe. His phone began to ring late at night with voices whispering threats. Cars followed him home from meetings. Crosses burned again on lawns, their flames reflected in his window. The Klan began to see Robert not as just another local troublemaker, but as a threat to the very order they had built their lives around. To them, a black man with education, military training, and a refusal to be afraid was more dangerous than any gun. They decided to remind him of his place, but they underestimated the man they were dealing with. Williams knew the risk. He also knew that the police would never protect them. He had seen too many cases where black men called for help only to be arrested themselves, where attackers walked free with a smile. He began to prepare quietly. He taught community members how to organize, how to stay calm under pressure, and how to document every act of injustice. He spoke of nonviolence when it worked, but he also spoke of self-respect. He believed that peace should never mean submission, that turning the other cheek did not mean turning away from danger. Each protest, each demand for equality drew the town closer to confrontation. The old power structures of Monroe, the politicians, the police, the business owners all saw Williams as the embodiment of rebellion. But to the people, he was becoming something else, a symbol of possibility. Parents whispered his name to their children, telling them about the man who dared to speak truth to the powerful. He gave them hope, and hope in the wrong hands, to those who ruled by fear, was the most dangerous weapon of all. When news of his efforts began to spread beyond Monroe, reporters from larger cities came to see for themselves. They wrote about the trouble in Monroe, portraying Williams as a radical, a man stirring up unrest. But those who lived there knew better. He was simply demanding that America honor its own promises. Still, the attention brought new tension, and the Klan, humiliated and angry, decided to act. One summer evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, men in white robes gathered at the edge of town. They had come for intimidation, but Robert was ready. That night would change everything for Monroe, for Williams, and for the civil rights struggle itself. Robert F. Williams had returned home to demand justice through law and organization. But what he found was a system too rotten to reform with words alone. The Klan's hatred would soon meet a resistance it had never faced before, a community that refused to be afraid. Led by a man who had already seen the worst the world could offer and still chose to stand tall. By 1957, the tension in Monroe had reached its breaking point. The air felt charged with fear, the kind that made every sunset a warning. The Klan had grown bolder, their caravans of trucks roaring through black neighborhoods at night, headlights cutting across windows like searchlights in a war zone. Men in hoods fired shots into the air, sometimes into homes, sometimes into nothing at all, as if to remind everyone that they could do so without consequence. The police said nothing, did nothing. For them, terror was not a crime, it was order maintained by other means. Robert F. Williams watched all this unfold with a quiet rage. He had marched, he had spoken, he had tried to reason. The naacp petitions, the letters to the mayor, the calls for federal attention, all had fallen on deaf ears. The law that was supposed to protect them had instead become another weapon in their oppressors' hands. And yet, even in the midst of fear, something new was stirring in the community. They had seen Robert stand firm when others bent. They had seen him face the police with calm authority, unarmed yet unyielding. But now the situation had crossed a line. The Klan had attacked peaceful protesters in broad daylight, firing into the crowd. Men fell. Women screamed. Children ran. No arrests were made. It was as if the town itself had decided that black lives were expendable. That night, Robert sat with a small group of trusted men, veterans who, like him, had worn the uniform of a country that had yet to honor its promises. They gathered in his living room, the air thick with smoke and unspoken anger. These were not men looking for revenge. They were fathers, husbands, workers, but each carried memories of battlefields far from home, memories of brothers who had died for freedom abroad while their families suffered under tyranny at home. Robert looked around the room and spoke with the steady tone of a man who had made his peace with danger. "If the law won't protect us," he said, "then we will protect ourselves." From that night on, the Monroe community changed. Under Robert's leadership, they began to organize in secret, methodically and carefully. They trained with the discipline he had learned in the Marines. They studied safety, defense, and responsibility. Every man who joined understood the gravity of their mission. It was not about aggression but survival. Robert reached out to the National Rifle Association and, to the surprise of many, successfully obtained an official charter for a local rifle club. He called it the Black Armed Guard. It was, on paper, a legitimate shooting club, but everyone knew what it truly meant. The formation of that group was an act of both courage and defiance. Never before in the Deep South had a black community openly declared its right to armed self-defense. The very idea shook the foundations of white supremacy, which depended on fear to function. Robert made sure the members followed strict rules. No one was to act without cause, no one was to provoke, and every weapon was to be used only in defense. The point was not to start a war, but to make it clear that their community would no longer be an easy target. Word spread quickly. Some called them militants. Others called them heroes. The people of Monroe, long accustomed to the nightly threat of the Klan, began to feel something they had almost forgotten: safety. When the hooded men came driving through their streets, they were no longer met with silence. They were met with watchful eyes and the faint but unmistakable gleam of redness. The sound of gunfire from the Klan's trucks began to fade as nights passed uneventfully. Fear was no longer a one-way weapon. For Robert, the creation of the Black Armed Guard was not about glory. It was a response born of necessity, shaped by years of witnessing the limits of peaceful appeals. He still respected the voices preaching nonviolence, but he understood something that polite America preferred to ignore: that peace without protection was a fragile illusion. He believed that a man's right to defend his family was sacred, and that dignity required more than patience. It required preparation. The Klan, humiliated by their failed attempt to intimidate Monroe's black community, plotted to reclaim control. They organized another raid, targeting the home of a local black doctor who had stood beside Robert in protests. But this time, things were different. As the Klan's trucks approached, the doctor's house was not dark and defenseless. It was surrounded by men who had been trained, disciplined, and resolute. When the attackers opened fire, they were met with an unexpected response: a volley of return shots that sent them scrambling back into the night. No one was killed that night, but something far greater had happened. For the first time in living memory, the Klan retreated. The sound of their engines fading into the distance marked more than a tactical victory. It was the moment fear changed sides. From that day forward, the raids stopped. The people of Monroe walked with straighter backs. Mothers slept through the night without clutching their children in fear. The men of the Black Armed Guard became quiet legends in their town, not for violence, but for restoring a sense of human worth that no law had ever given them. Of course, not everyone approved. National civil rights leaders, alarmed by the idea of armed resistance, distanced themselves from Williams. The press painted him as dangerous, a man who had stepped beyond the boundaries of acceptable protest. But in Monroe, he was something far simpler: a protector. Those who lived through those nights would remember him not as a radical, but as the man who had refused to let terror rule their lives any longer. The foundation of the Black Armed Guard would become a defining chapter in Robert F. Williams' life, one that foreshadowed a broader awakening across America. Long before the slogans of Black Power echoed in the streets, before the world knew the names of Malcolm X or the Black Panthers, there was a man in a small southern town who decided that dignity was worth defending. He had transformed fear into resolve, showing that courage, when rooted in love for one's people, could stand firm even in the face of hate. The night the Klan came for the doctor's house began like so many others in Monroe: quiet, heavy with the tension of a town divided. The summer air was thick, and the streets seemed to hold their breath. In the black neighborhoods, lights were dimmed early, not from weariness but from caution. Everyone knew that when the sun went down, danger woke up. The Klan had been restless after their last humiliation, their pride wounded by the knowledge that the people they once hunted had begun to stand their ground. They wanted to send a message, and their message was always written in fire. Albert E. Perry was a respected physician, a man who treated his patients with compassion no matter who they were. He had worked beside Robert Williams in the local naacp, helping organize protests and petitioning for desegregation. To the Klan, that made him a traitor to their idea of order. Rumors spread that they planned to make an example of him, to burn his house. Maybe worse. Williams heard the whispers, and he knew better than to dismiss them. He had seen how violence always followed words in Monroe. He called his men, the members of the Black Armed Guard, and told them to be ready. They would not provoke, but they would not be caught unprepared. As darkness fell, the sound of engines broke the silence. The growl of trucks echoed from the highway. Drawing closer. Louder. The men of the guard took their positions around Dr. Perry's house, hidden behind trees and porches, their hearts pounding in rhythm with the approaching noise. They had no illusions about what was coming. They were outnumbered, but not outmatched. Each man understood the stakes if they faltered tonight. The Klan would rule by fear once again. The trucks came into view, headlights slicing through the dark. Dozens of men in white robes and hoods spilled out, their torches flaring against the night sky. For a brief moment, the light illuminated the doctor's home, standing quietly at the edge of the street like a symbol of defiance. Then came the sound that Monroe had learned to dread, the first shot, sharp and deliberate, tearing through the stillness. Glass shattered. A woman screamed inside the house. Williams gave no speeches that night. He simply raised his hand, and the men of the guard returned fire, not in panic, but with the controlled precision of trained soldiers. The night erupted with sound. Bullets struck trees and fences, sparks flying as metal met wood. The Klan, expecting another easy raid, had walked into something they had never faced before: organized, disciplined resistance. Their trucks became targets, their confidence shattered by the realization that they were not untouchable. Within minutes, the attackers began to falter. The sound of gunfire grew more scattered, then distant. The once mighty Klan caravan turned and fled down the road, leaving behind nothing but dust, broken glass, and their wounded pride. When silence finally returned, it was not the silence of fear, it was the silence of a people realizing they had won. Word spread through Monroe like wildfire. By dawn, everyone knew what had happened. The Klan had been driven back. For the first time in living memory, the hunters had become the hunted. Mothers whispered the news with disbelief and relief. Fathers stood taller that morning. The local authorities, embarrassed and anxious, rushed to contain the situation. They called for calm, but their sudden concern fooled no one. For years, they had turned away from the suffering of the black community. Now, they were forced to confront it. The town's white leadership moved quickly to save face. They announced new restrictions on rallies and public demonstrations, citing public safety. But everyone knew the truth: these measures were not for safety. They were an admission of defeat, an acknowledgement that the Klan's reign of unchecked terror had ended. The days of burning crosses and midnight rides were over, at least in Monroe. Robert Williams did not celebrate. He knew what this victory meant, and what it might cost. He stood outside Dr. Perry's home as the morning light spread across the street, the smell of gunpowder still lingering in the air. He saw neighbors gathering, their faces a mixture of awe and uncertainty. Some thanked him with quiet words. Others looked afraid, not of him, but of what might come next. Williams understood their fear. He also understood that a line had been crossed not by him, but by history itself. Once people had seen that they could resist, they would never again accept submission. The national press caught wind of the story. Some reporters portrayed it as a scandal, a reckless act of defiance that threatened to derail the civil rights movement's message of nonviolence. But others saw something different, a community refusing to die quietly. Letters poured in, some praising Williams, others condemning him. Yet the people of Monroe knew the truth that the headlines missed. They knew that peace built on fear was not peace at all. In the weeks that followed, Monroe settled into an easy calm. The Klan's presence faded. The late-night threats stopped. The same police who once ignored the suffering of the black community now patrolled their neighborhoods. Not out of compassion, but out of caution. The power dynamic had shifted, and everyone felt it. Robert Williams continued his work, though he was no longer just a local activist. He had become a symbol, both celebrated and feared. Some in the national naacp leadership worried that his actions might spark copycat movements, that armed defense could undermine the broader cause. But Williams was not interested in their approval. He believed that his community had the right to safety, the right to dignity, the right to live without terror. He had not started a war. He had ended one. The events at Perry's home marked the moment Monroe changed forever. It was the night when the veil of helplessness was torn away and replaced by something stronger resolve. The men who had stood beside Robert Williams that evening did not see themselves as heroes. They were simply tired of running, tired of watching their families live under a shadow of fear. In the quiet that followed, Monroe's black community began to live differently. Children played outside again. Church services ended without the anxious glances toward the door. For Robert, it was a bittersweet victory. He had proven that dignity could not be destroyed by terror, but he also knew that such defiance came with a price. The world would soon turn its eyes to him, and not all would understand what Monroe had truly fought for. But in that moment, as the sun rose over the small Carolina town, one truth was undeniable. The Klan had come to break them and left broken themselves. Williams' rise to national attention came not just from his willingness to defend his people, but from his unflinching honesty in a time when silence was often mistaken for peace. As the 1950s unfolded, America's civil rights movement began to define itself under the philosophy of nonviolence championed by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., whose moral courage inspired millions. Yet in Monroe, North Carolina, Robert F. Williams faced a different kind of battlefield, one where the threat of violence was not abstract, but immediate, where a burning cross could appear on a neighbor's lawn any night, and the law would look the other way. For Williams, the question was not whether peace was noble, but whether it was enough to keep his people alive. The line he walked was perilous. In national circles, Williams was admired as a disciplined leader of the naacp's Monroe chapter, one who had successfully desegregated the local public library and challenged racist hiring practices. But among the white establishment in North Carolina, he was branded as a dangerous agitator, someone who refused to accept the place society had carved out for him. His home was under constant watch, his phone tapped, his mail intercepted. Yet he never stopped organizing, never stopped teaching the young men of Monroe that dignity was not something granted, it was defended. Then came the moment that would change everything. In an interview following a violent incident in Monroe, Williams was asked whether he still believed in nonviolence. His answer was measured, calm, but it hit the nation like a thunderclap. "If we are attacked," he said, "we will defend ourselves. We will meet violence with violence." The word spread like wildfire across newspapers and radio broadcasts. For some, it was a declaration of courage. For others, an act of rebellion against the moral spine of the civil rights movement. The national naacp leadership, fearful of losing public support and government backing, quickly suspended Williams from his position. It was a decision that cut deep. He had given years to the organization, organizing boycotts, challenging segregation, risking his life. Yet now, his belief in self-defense deemed too radical, too dangerous, too far from the image of peaceful resistance that the movement sought to project. For Williams, it was not betrayal, it was proof of the limits of respectability politics in a world that refused to respect black lives. Still, even in disgrace, he refused to be silent. Newspapers painted him as militant, the kind of man who would ignite chaos in the South. But those who knew him saw something different: a father protecting his children, a leader defending his town, a man who simply refused to watch another funeral of a young black man killed for existing. His philosophy was not about vengeance. It was about survival. He did not seek confrontation, but neither would he surrender to terror. Monroe, once a quiet town, became a microcosm of America's larger struggle. Journalists arrived from across the country, trying to understand this man who dared to question the very core of nonviolence. Some compared him to Malcolm, though the two had never met. Others called him reckless. But those who visited Monroe saw a different reality: streets where families could finally sleep through the night, where men no longer trembled when trucks with Confederate flags drove by, where women walked to church without fear. In the shadows of history, Williams' words echoed far beyond the cotton fields of North Carolina. His insistence that Black Americans had the right to defend themselves resonated deeply, especially among young activists who would later form the backbone of the Black Power movement. They saw in him a model of courage that refused to conform to the expectations of a society built on their silence. Though publicly cast aside, Williams' influence was quietly growing. His message found listeners not only in the American South but across the world. Letters poured in from Africa, Asia, and Latin America, from people who understood what it meant to resist oppression. They saw in him not an extremist, but a man who embodied a global struggle for human dignity. As the 1960s dawned, Robert F. Williams stood at a crossroads, admired by many, condemned by others, yet unbroken. His belief that self-defense was a human right had already begun to reshape the moral language of the civil rights era. In the years to come, that belief would carry him through exile, revolution, and redemption. But for now, in Monroe, he remained what he had always been: a protector, a teacher, and a man unwilling to bow to fear. By 1961, Monroe had become a town teetering on the edge of chaos. Years of tension, fed by deep-rooted prejudice and fear, erupted one summer afternoon when a white couple drove into a black neighborhood and found themselves caught in the middle of unrest. In the confusion, shots were fired, tempers flared, and rumors spread like wildfire. By nightfall, the name Robert Williams was on every radio broadcast in the state. Without evidence, without a fair hearing, he was accused of kidnapping the couple, an accusation that carried not just the weight of law, but the fury of those who had long wanted to see him silenced. Williams understood the danger instantly. He knew the history of his country too well, the way justice was often bent to preserve the comfort of those in power. He had seen men dragged from their homes, tried by mobs before dawn, their stories buried before they ever reached a courtroom. So when word came that warrants had been issued for his arrest, he made a decision not born of fear but of survival. With his wife Mabel and their children, he fled Monroe under cover of night, heading south and then east, leaving behind the town he had fought so hard to protect. Their journey would take them beyond the borders of America, across the Caribbean, and into the heart of the Cold War. In Cuba, Williams found not only refuge but an unexpected platform. The Cuban government, eager to expose racial hypocrisy in the United States, offered him asylum and the tools to speak freely. For the first time in years, his voice could reach beyond the threats of Monroe, beyond the southern states, beyond even the borders of his country. From a modest studio in Havana, Williams launched Radio Free Dixie, a broadcast unlike anything the American South had ever heard. Late at night, as static-filled frequencies crackled across state lines, listeners from Alabama to Michigan tuned into his deep, measured voice. He played the music of jazz legends and gospel choirs, weaving stories of resistance and pride between the melodies. But beneath the rhythm and soul, there was always a message. Dignity was not a crime, and self-defense was not hatred. He spoke not as a man divided from his homeland, but as one still deeply bound to it, calling on his brothers and sisters to remember their worth in a world that tried to erase it. The broadcast spread like whispered secrets, carried through radios in kitchens, basements, and back porches. Some called him a rebel, others a revolutionary. To the young men and women listening in the dark, he was something else entirely, a reminder that they were not powerless. Williams' words, firm but hopeful, became a blueprint for a new generation tired of waiting for permission to exist. His influence deepened with the publication of his book, Negroes with Guns. It was not a manifesto of aggression but a testimony of endurance. Penages, he recounted the struggle of Monroe, the nights of fear, the courage it took to stand armed not in anger but in defense. He wrote of what it meant to protect one's children from harm, to demand justice without apology. The book challenged both the complacency of white America and the cautious restraint of the mainstream civil rights movement. It was an act of truth-telling, written by a man who had seen the limits of nonviolence and refused to let history forget those who had no choice but to fight back. Negroes with Guns found its way into the hands of those who would soon redefine the struggle for equality. Young activists like Huey Newton and Bobby Seale, the future founders of the Black Panther Party, cited Williams as a guiding light. His ideas, community protection, armed self-respect, and solidarity became the foundation of their movement. Though separated by exile, his influence traveled through the currents of change, shaping the philosophy of Black power that would dominate the late 1960s. For Williams, exile was both freedom and exile in every sense. In Havana, he was treated as a hero, a symbol of defiance against racial injustice. Yet every sunrise reminded him of home, the streets of Monroe, the neighbors who had once stood beside him, the unfinished battle for justice in the land that had cast him out. He spoke often of America, not with bitterness but with a kind of sorrowful love. "It is still my home," he once said in an interview. "I only want it to live up to its own promise." Even as he became a voice of global resistance, the cost of his defiance lingered. His family lived under constant watch, their letters screened, their movements monitored. American newspapers labeled him a traitor, and the FBI placed him on its most wanted list. But through it all, he remained calm, disciplined, and unwavering. In his heart, he still saw himself as a protector of his people, not an enemy of his country. Years later, historians would look back on Williams' time in Cuba as one of the most remarkable chapters in the civil rights era, a moment when a man, branded a fugitive, became a beacon. Through radio waves and written words, he carried the story of Monroe into the conscience of the world. His exile, instead of silencing him, amplified his message. That dignity, once claimed, cannot be taken away. And while his voice faded into static as the years passed, its echo remained a rhythm of courage that would inspire generations to come. Long after the microphones were turned off and the world had forgotten the name Robert F. Williams. When Robert Williams finally returned to the United States in the late 1960s, the country he came back to was not the same one he had fled. The marches, the sit-ins, the sacrifices, and the voices that had risen in the decades since his exile had changed the landscape of America forever. Yet beneath the surface of progress, Williams knew that the battle for dignity was far from over. The Civil Rights Act had been signed, and segregation was now illegal by law, but the wounds of the past still ran deep. He settled quietly in Michigan with his wife Mabel, the same woman who had stood beside him through every trial, every broadcast, and every night of uncertainty in exile. Their home was modest, surrounded by tall trees and snow-filled winters, a far cry from the humid tension of Monroe. Here, Williams found a rare peace. He read. He wrote. He mentored younger activists who came to his door seeking the wisdom of a man who had lived through what history books could barely capture. He never sought fame or recognition. For him, survival was not about glory. It was about staying true to his principles until the end. Even in the quiet years, his influence refused to fade. His book Negroes with Guns continued to circulate among students, scholars, and activists who found in its pages a voice both unyielding and human. His insistence on dignity as a right, not a privilege, became a moral compass for movements that followed. The Black Power generation embraced his example of community protection and self-respect, while even those who preached nonviolence acknowledged the depth of his conviction. Williams' legacy was not in opposition to peace, but in the pursuit of a peace that could only exist when fear no longer dictated the lives of Black Americans. In time, the world began to recognize the courage that had once made him an outcast. He was invited to speak at universities, to share his story with a new generation that had only known his name through rumor and legend. And among those who honored him most deeply was Rosa Parks, the very symbol of peaceful defiance. She called him a hero of courage and justice, a man who had dared to act when the world preferred that he remain silent. Coming from her, those words meant more than any medal or title. They were a quiet acknowledgement that courage takes many forms, and that both the pen and the rifle had their place in the long road to freedom. As the years passed, Robert Williams' health began to decline, but his spirit remained as steady as ever. He continued to speak out against hypocrisy and injustice, urging young people never to let history repeat itself. "You must understand where you come from," he told them once in an interview. "If you forget that, someone else will write your story for you, and they will make you believe you were powerless." He passed away in 1996, surrounded by family, far from the violence that had defined so much of his early life. The world did not erupt in headlines or fanfare. His death came quietly, like the closing of a long and powerful song. But for those who knew his story, for those who had tuned into Radio Free Dixie or held a copy of Negroes with Guns in their hands, his passing was not an end. It was the completion of a circle, a man who had refused to bow to fear finally resting in the peace he had fought to make possible. Today, Robert F. Williams stands as one of the most complex and courageous figures of the civil rights era, a man whose belief in self-defense challenged the conscience of a nation and forced it to look honestly at what justice really meant. His legacy reminds us that freedom is not given, it is earned, protected, and defended, sometimes by those willing to stand when standing comes at the greatest cost. If you have listened to this story and found in it a spark of inspiration, a moment that made you reflect on courage, dignity, or the price of conviction, then his voice still echoes. Because Robert Williams did not fight only for his generation. He fought for the right of every person to live with their head held high, unafraid, and unashamed of who they are. Thank you for watching and for taking this journey through a history too often forgotten. Stories like this remind us that real change comes not just from speeches, but from the unyielding will of ordinary people who refuse to accept injustice as their fate. If you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, please take a moment to like this video, share it with others who care about truth and history, and subscribe to the channel. Every gesture of support helps keep these voices alive and ensures that the courage of people like Robert F. Williams will never be silenced again.